Have you ever questioned the legacy of Mahatma Gandhi? What if I told you there's more to his story than the peaceful icon we've been taught about? Today, we unravel the shocking, ugly truth about Gandhi. Was Gandhi truly the saintly figure we have been taught to revere, or is there a darker side to his legacy? In this shocking reveal, we explore the complex, controversial, and often explosive truth about Mahatma Gandhi, the man who led India to independence from British colonial rule. While he is celebrated as the father of the nation in India, Gandhi's life and beliefs were not without their contradictions and controversies. Mahatma Gandhi, a name synonymous with peace, non-violence, and the fight for India's independence. We've all been taught that he was a saint, an idealist who changed the world. But what if the truth is more complicated? Today, we uncover some shocking, ugly truth about Mahatma Gandhi. Who was he really? And was he truly the hero we've come to believe? Or a wolf in sheep's clothing? From his early life, education, and controversial relationships with women, to his spirituality, to his strained relationships with other Indian freedom fighters, to his disturbing views on race, to his untimely death, we uncover the lesser-known aspects of his life that challenge his iconic image. Let's start by looking into his early background. He was born on October 2, 1869 in Porbandar, Gujarat, into a middle-class Hindu family. His full name was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. We will, from this point on, refer to him as Mohandas or Gandhi. His father was a political figure, the Diwan, Prime Minister of Porbandar, and his mother was deeply religious. But even from an early age, Gandhi's life was marked by contradictions. Gandhi's early education was typical for a boy of his class, but it wasn't until he moved to London to study law that he began to form his ideology. This is where his life took a major turn. He faced intense racism while in England and began his belief in the superiority of Indian culture over the West. At the age of 13, Gandhi was married to Kasturba, a match arranged by their parents. Their marriage was not a happy one. Gandhi's deep commitment to celibacy after marriage created tension. In fact, his relationship with Kasturba was often described as cold and distant, with Gandhi imposing strict lifestyle rules on her. Gandhi and Kasturba had 4 children, but Gandhi's paternal role was often absent. He was more consumed with his ideas of self-purification, fasting, and spirituality than being present for his children. His refusal to prioritize family life over his ideals led to criticism. Gandhi's spiritual life was marked by an obsessive commitment to asceticism. He believed in strict self-discipline, often fasting for days as a form of protest or purification. But despite his famous advocacy for nonviolence, Gandhi's ideas were often more extreme than we realize. He was a staunch believer in nonviolence or ahimsa, but his methods weren't always as peaceful as they seemed. His campaigns of non-cooperation often led to violent clashes, and at times he failed to protect his followers when violence broke out. Gandhi's stance on issues like caste, untouchability, and women's rights was also divisive. While he fought for the rights of the untouchables, his approach was often patronizing and paternalistic. Let's explore his relationship with women. Perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects of Gandhi's life was his relationships with women. While married to Kasturba, Gandhi had an unusual and at times questionable relationship with young women. Most notably his grandniece, Manu, whom he had a strange and disturbing, physically intimate bond with. In the early 1900s, Gandhi began experimenting with a highly controversial practice of sleeping next to young women, including his grandniece, Manu Gandhi, who was often his companion during these experiments, is one of the most controversial and disturbing aspects of his personal life and raised serious ethical and moral concerns. While Gandhi's acts of non-violence, his role in India's independence struggle, and his ideas about self-discipline and asceticism are widely known, this particular behavior raises significant ethical questions and has been the subject of intense debate among historians, scholars, and critics. Gandhi supposedly believed that his physical proximity to these women would purify him, but many critics argue that these actions bordered on exploitation. At the core of Gandhi's actions was his belief in celibacy, brahmacharya, and the idea of self-purification. Gandhi was committed to a life of asceticism, which meant he practiced extreme self-discipline in both his thoughts and actions. He believed that celibacy was not just a personal virtue, but also an essential part of his spiritual development and the path to achieving moral and physical purity. Gandhi regarded his commitment to celibacy as a way of overcoming worldly desires and cultivating a higher level of spirituality. As part of this commitment, Gandhi would often talk about the importance of controlling sexual desires as a way to attain greater inner peace and spiritual power. In his writings, Gandhi frequently linked sexual purity to moral and social empowerment. He believed that sleeping in close proximity to young women without engaging in any sexual activity would test his ability to control his sexual urges and demonstrate his commitment to celibacy. He famously declared that he could lie next to them without being tempted, considering it an important part of his spiritual journey. Gandhi saw this practice as a means of self-purification and a form of testing his self-control. Gandhi himself, however, admitted that the practice might be misunderstood and that it had led to misunderstandings among his followers. Gandhi's relationship with Manu and other women involved in these experiments is not without serious ethical concerns. Despite Gandhi's insistence that his actions were spiritual in nature and focused on his moral development, many people have interpreted this behavior as troubling, even exploitative. His insistence on sleeping in the same bed with young women under the guise of testing his sexual control raised questions about the potential for abuse of power, manipulation, and the violation of boundaries, especially when it involved adolescent girls. Gandhi's behavior was not hidden. It became a matter of public record, especially during his later years when he was widely known and influential. Many people, both within and outside of India, were disturbed by this practice. Some questioned whether Gandhi's insistence on sleeping with young women was truly about spiritual development or whether it was a manifestation of personal desires masked as a religious practice. Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India and one of Gandhi's closest associates, was uncomfortable with many of Gandhi's practices, including his experiments with celibacy. Nehru is reported to have expressed his reservations about Gandhi's experiments with women in his autobiography, suggesting that Gandhi's obsession with his experiments often bordered on obsession and made others uncomfortable. Some of Gandhi's contemporaries, including key figures in the Indian independence movement, also questioned his decisions and practices. For example, leaders like Subhas Chandra Bose had differing opinions about Gandhi's influence on the movement and his personal methods. While they respected his role in leading India to independence, they were skeptical of some of his personal behaviors. In contemporary times, Gandhi's practice of sleeping with young women has been heavily scrutinized. Many modern scholars, feminists, and ethical critics see it as an abuse of power, particularly given the patriarchal and hierarchical nature of Gandhi's relationship with his followers. While Gandhi's intentions may have been rooted in his spiritual journey, the actions themselves raise serious questions about consent, manipulation, and the nature of the teacher-disciple relationship. Psychologically, the power dynamics between Gandhi and the young women who participated in these experiments have been questioned. These women, some of whom were young and vulnerable, may have felt compelled to participate due to their reverence for Gandhi and the hierarchical structure of the ashram. Gandhi's position as a revered leader and spiritual figure may have created an environment in which the boundaries between spiritual mentorship and exploitation became blurred. The legacy of Gandhi's sleeping practices with young women is a deeply troubling aspect of his life, and it has complicated his legacy. While Gandhi is widely admired for his philosophy of non-violence, his role in the Indian independence movement, and his advocacy for social justice, particularly regarding untouchability and religious tolerance, these personal behaviors have cast a shadow over his legacy. Historians and scholars now view this as one of the more problematic aspects of Gandhi's life, one that must be confronted and debated in any honest assessment of his life. His contributions to the world, particularly his leadership in the Indian independence struggle, are undeniable, but his actions concerning women, especially his sleeping with them under the guise of spiritual experiments, raise important questions about the complexities of his personal and moral life. Gandhi's sleeping with young women, including his grandnieces, as part of his experiments in celibacy and self-discipline, is indeed one of the most controversial aspects of his life. While Gandhi defended it as part of his spiritual journey, the practice raises serious ethical and moral concerns, especially regarding the power dynamics, consent, and the potential for abuse. Today, this aspect of his life remains a point of contention, revealing the complexity and contradictions within his personal and public legacy. Gandhi's life, like many historical figures, demonstrates that even those with lofty ideals can have deeply troubled aspects to their character and behavior. Next, let's take a look into Gandhi's early views on the Holocaust, Hitler, and the Nazis. Gandhi's views on Adolf Hitler, the Nazis, and the Jews are complex and controversial, reflecting both his philosophy of non-violence, ahimsa, and the specific context in which he was writing and speaking. Gandhi's stance on these issues was shaped by his commitment to non-violence, as well as his belief in the power of peaceful resistance. But his views also revealed troubling contradictions and misunderstandings, particularly in his approach to the Jewish plight during the Holocaust. In the 1930s, as Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany, Gandhi expressed a mix of skepticism, moral condemnation, and calls for non-violence. Initially, Gandhi was aware of the rise of fascism in Europe, but his response was largely shaped by his overarching belief that violence, even in the face of extreme oppression, was never the solution. Gandhi's main objection to Hitler and the Nazi regime stemmed from the violent and oppressive methods employed by the Nazis. However, his reaction was not solely based on anti-Semitism or a specific condemnation of Nazi ideology. It was largely grounded in his belief that violence and hatred would only perpetuate more suffering. In an infamous statement from 1938, Gandhi wrote about Hitler in a way that has been widely criticized. He described Hitler as an efficient and fearless ruler, and at one point he said that it was a good thing that Hitler had aroused the German people from their slumber. However, he immediately followed this by stating that Hitler's methods of achieving his goals were wrong because they were rooted in violence and cruelty. Gandhi believed that violence would lead only to destruction, even though he was acknowledging that Hitler had been successful in consolidating power. Gandhi's somewhat contradictory statements in this context were shaped by his belief that every human being, even a dictator like Hitler, had the potential for change. He hoped that if confronted by non-violence, Hitler might realize the futility of his violent actions and change his ways. Gandhi wrote, "I regard Hitler as an evil man, but I regard him as a man and not as a demon." He believed that people like Hitler could be transformed, but only through self-purification and non-violent methods. While Gandhi was critical of the Nazis' violence and oppression, his response to Hitler and fascism remained somewhat disconcertingly measured. He did not call for military intervention against Hitler's aggression and instead advocated for a solution based on moral principles, even if this seemed unrealistic in the face of Nazi expansionism. Gandhi's stance on the persecution of the Jews under the Nazi regime is one of the most troubling aspects of his beliefs, especially given his reputation as a moral leader. Gandhi's views on the Jews and the Holocaust have been criticized for a lack of empathy and understanding of the severity of Nazi anti-Semitism. His response to the plight of the Jews was based on his non-violent principles, but he often seemed to minimize the scale and nature of the Nazi regime's violence. He believed that the Jews should respond to Hitler's oppression with passive resistance and non-violence. Gandhi felt that the Jews should not resist Hitler with violence, and he controversially suggested that the Jews should resist the Nazi oppressors with soul force rather than physical violence. In his writings, Gandhi suggested that if Jews faced death, they should be willing to accept martyrdom rather than engage in violent defense. In this regard, he once wrote, "If the Jews in Germany resist, they will be crushed. It is better for them to suffer than to retaliate with violence." Gandhi believed that even in the face of mass slaughter, the Jewish people should resist non-violently, which was a starkly unrealistic position given the genocidal nature of Nazi policies. This perspective has been widely criticized for its naive idealism and lack of understanding of the scale of the atrocities being committed against the Jews. His views on Zionism, the movement for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, were also ambivalent and critical. He believed that the Jews should not establish a separate state in Palestine, as he felt this would only lead to more violence. Gandhi advocated for peaceful coexistence between Jews and Arabs, and he argued that both groups should live together in harmony in Palestine. He did not support the idea of a Jewish nation-state, as he felt it could provoke conflict in the region. In a 1938 article in his newspaper, Harijan, Gandhi wrote, "The Jews have as much right to their home as anyone else, but not at the cost of the Arabs. The Jews are an interesting people with a remarkable history, but I do not believe that the way to help them is to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. They should live peacefully with the Arabs and other nations." Gandhi's position was driven by his belief in non-violence and his skepticism about the possibility of achieving peace through nationalistic movements, which he viewed as inherently divisive. His response to the Holocaust itself is less clear. He did not directly address the scale of the atrocities or offer a sustained condemnation of the Nazi genocide of the Jews. His focus remained on the moral righteousness of non-violence, even in the face of the Holocaust. As the war progressed, it became increasingly difficult for anyone to ignore the magnitude of the Holocaust, but Gandhi's writings on the subject remained relatively sparse and ambiguous. It's important to note that Gandhi did not deny the suffering of the Jewish people or the reality of Nazi atrocities. But his response, largely rooted in his pacifist philosophy, was so focused on non-violent resistance that it seemed disconnected from the reality of what was happening in Europe. His pacifism led him to oppose the use of force even in a time of unimaginable violence, which many critics have argued was a dangerously misguided stance. In the post-Holocaust era, Gandhi's comments have been heavily criticized for their lack of sensitivity to the scale of Nazi brutality and their naive optimism about the power of non-violence in the face of such extreme oppression. Critics argue that Gandhi's insistence on non-violence as a universal solution to every situation blinded him to the reality of Nazi genocidal policies. Gandhi's failure to call for more practical and immediate action against Nazi violence is seen by many as an alarming blind spot in his thinking. Jewish leaders and scholars have expressed deep dissatisfaction with Gandhi's treatment of the Jewish people and the Holocaust. For instance, in his writings and speeches, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, a prominent British Jewish theologian, critiqued Gandhi's approach to non-violence, especially in relation to the extreme circumstances presented by Nazi aggression during World War II. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks made his statement regarding Mahatma Gandhi's pacifism in the context of the Nazi regime in several of his writings, but the most prominent place where he discussed this is in his book The Dignity of Difference: How to Avoid the Clash of Civilizations, 2002. Sacks argued that while Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence was deeply moral and had transformative power in the context of British colonialism in India, it was insufficient when faced with the existential threat posed by Hitler and the Nazis. He pointed out that pacifism, as advocated by Gandhi, failed to recognize the necessity of force in stopping the evil of Nazi tyranny, which was bent on annihilating entire groups of people, including Jews, and aggressively expanding its empire. In his view, moral imperatives, such as stopping genocide and preventing further atrocities, sometimes require the use of force. For Sacks, the inability to confront evil with the appropriate means, such as military force in the case of the Nazis, was not just a tactical oversight, but a profound moral failure when viewed in the context of the Holocaust. This perspective aligns with broader critiques of pacifism in the face of extreme evil, particularly when non-violence would leave vulnerable populations at the mercy of aggressors. Gandhi's views on Hitler, the Nazis, and the Jews were deeply shaped by his philosophy of non-violence, but they were also marked by significant naivety, contradictions, and insensitivity. While his rejection of violence was based on moral principles, his reluctance to recognize the full scale of Nazi cruelty and his belief that non-violent resistance could overcome such an oppressive regime have been widely criticized. In retrospect, Gandhi's idealistic stance, especially towards the Jews under Nazi persecution, seems out of touch with the reality of the Holocaust. His belief in the power of soul force was a noble ideal in many contexts, but it failed to provide a meaningful response to the unique and horrific nature of the Nazi regime's policies. Gandhi's failure to offer a clearer, more forceful condemnation of Hitler's atrocities remains one of the more troubling aspects of his legacy. Let's discuss his controversial views on race and Black Africans. Mahatma Gandhi's views on race are among the most controversial and complex aspects of his life and legacy. Although he is widely regarded as a champion of equality and non-violence, particularly in his fight against British colonialism, his views on race, especially during his early years, were not as progressive or universally tolerant as one might expect from such an iconic figure. First, let's dissect his early views on race in South Africa, 1893-1914. Gandhi's formative experiences with race began when he moved to South Africa in 1893 to work as a legal advisor for an Indian trading firm. It was during this period that Gandhi's views on race were deeply influenced by the discrimination he faced as an Indian in a racially segregated society. In his early years in South Africa, Gandhi held prejudiced views about Black Africans. He considered them to be inferior to Indians. He referred to them using derogatory terms such as Kafirs, a racial slur used by white South Africans for black people. This was consistent with the general attitude of many Indians, who, like many other colonized people, felt a sense of superiority over Africans. Here is an example from Gandhi's early writings. Gandhi once wrote in his newspaper, Indian Opinion, that the Indian community in South Africa should maintain a superior status to the Black Africans, believing that they were more civilized due to their higher social status, education, and religion. This reflects the colonial mindset of racial hierarchy that was prevalent among many Indians, particularly those who had benefited from British rule. Gandhi's initial activism in South Africa was focused on improving the social and legal standing of Indians in the country. he campaigned against laws that discriminated against Indians, such as the requirement for them to carry passes. But at this point, his fight did not extend to advocating for the rights of black South Africans, whom he still viewed as inferior. Over time, Gandhi's views on race evolved significantly, but this transformation occurred very slowly. His time in South Africa played a pivotal role in shaping his later thoughts on equality and justice, even though some of his earlier views remained problematic. The shift toward universal equality. By the time he returned to India in 1915, Gandhi had begun to distance himself from his earlier racist views, influenced partly by his interactions with black South Africans and his exposure to the racial injustices of the British colonial system. He became a vocal critic of the apartheid system and discrimination based on race, although he still reserved a sense of racial pride for Indians, especially in his advocacy for Indian civilization over European or Western norms. The influence of his spirituality. Gandhi's evolving spiritual beliefs, especially his commitment to nonviolence, ahimsa, and truth, satya, also influenced his understanding of race. By the time he returned to India, he increasingly saw the fight for Indian independence as part of a larger struggle against all forms of injustice, including racial oppression. He began to express ideas of equality that included both Indians and black South Africans, as well as people of all races, although he was still not without some flaws in this regard. Let's explore Gandhi's views on black South Africans later in life. By the time of the 1920s, Gandhi's views on black South Africans had become more inclusive, especially after his time in India. He publicly acknowledged that black South Africans were suffering from the same racial discrimination he had fought against. However, there were still contradictions in his approach. On one hand, he criticized the British for their oppression of black Africans and argued for better treatment for them. On the other hand, his advocacy for black South Africans was often couched in terms that still reflected his belief in Indian cultural and civilizational superiority. For instance, Gandhi spoke out against the segregated train compartments, but still made statements about how the Indian soul is different from the black soul. While Gandhi began to champion the cause of non-Europeans more broadly, he did so in a context that still framed the Indian struggle for equality in a way that was often patronizing toward black Africans. Next, let's take a look at Gandhi and the caste and untouchability debate. While Gandhi's views on race evolved, his advocacy for social justice in India also intersected with his efforts to address caste-based discrimination, particularly the plight of the untouchables, whom he referred to as Harijans, children of God. Gandhi sought to address the social exclusion and violence faced by the untouchables, advocating for their inclusion in temples, schools, and public spaces. His commitment to their upliftment was significant, and he saw their liberation as central to India's independence movement. However, his views on caste were often criticized as insufficiently radical. Some have argued that Gandhi's efforts to reform the caste system were ultimately conservative, reinforcing the caste hierarchy rather than challenging it. His emphasis on uplifting the untouchables without directly confronting the structures of caste-based discrimination has been a point of contention. So what is Gandhi's posthumous legacy on race? On January 30th, 1948, Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated in New Delhi, India, by Nathuram Godse, a Hindu nationalist. After Gandhi's death, his legacy remained controversial, especially regarding race. In India, he is primarily hailed as a champion of non-violence and social justice, and his influence on the civil rights movement globally, particularly through figures like Martin Luther King Jr., helped bolster his image as a universal symbol of racial equality. However, his early racist attitudes, particularly toward black Africans, have caused many to reassess his legacy in the modern world. In South Africa, Gandhi's early views on race were not easily overlooked, and some critics have called for a more nuanced view of his contributions to the country's struggle for racial equality. In fact, some South African activists, particularly within the black community, have rejected Gandhi's legacy due to the harmful nature of his earlier beliefs about race. Ultimately, Gandhi's views on race were complex and evolved over time. While he is often remembered as a global icon of nonviolence and resistance against oppression, his early racial prejudice, particularly his derogatory views toward black Africans, cannot be ignored. Gandhi's belief in racial equality came only after a long process of self-reflection and learning, but his early views continued to challenge the sanctified image of him as a purely progressive figure. The legacy of Gandhi's racial beliefs is mixed. On one hand, his later life exemplified a fight for justice for all, including marginalized and oppressed races. On the other hand, his early attitudes were steeped in the hierarchical racial thinking of his time, and his actions were sometimes at odds with the principles of equality he later espoused. Thus, Gandhi's views on race serve as a reminder that even the most celebrated figures in history can have deeply problematic and complex legacies. Next, let's glimpse into his involvement with India's independence movement. Gandhi's leadership of India's independence movement was far from harmonious. He had contentious relationships with other prominent leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru and Sardar Patel, often underestimating their contributions or dismissing their approaches. His insistence on non-violence sometimes put him at odds with more militant freedom fighters like Subhas Chandra Bose, whose radical methods were seen as too extreme for Gandhi. Despite his calls for peace, Gandhi's reluctance to take decisive action during the partition of India led to massive bloodshed. His unwillingness to address the violent reality of partition is one of the darkest chapters of his leadership. As previously stated, on January 30, 1948, Gandhi was assassinated by Nathuram Godse, a Hindu nationalist, who blamed him for appeasing Muslims during the partition. Gandhi's death marked the end of an era, but his legacy has been a subject of intense debate. While Gandhi remains a beloved figure to many, especially in India, there's a growing movement to question his methods and legacy. Was he a visionary leader, a predator, a racist, or a man out of touch with the realities of his time? Gandhi's life was a mix of greatness and controversy. His ideals of non-violence, while inspiring, were often impractical in the real world. Today, we are left to wrestle with the complexities of his legacy, one that is neither wholly good nor wholly bad. The shocking truth is that Mohandas K. Gandhi was a man who, like many of us, was deeply flawed. If you are a fan of history, historical figures and events, and want a peek into real stories behind famous people like this video, then press subscribe now.